To understand the story of the old Cornwall societies, we must follow a thread back to the early 19th century, back to the tales and lore of the droll tellers and geese dancers collected by William Bottrell, the old Celt, as he styled himself. Indeed, the geese dancers themselves may have had a portent in the last lines of the 16th century Cornish mystery play Greans and Bees. Minstrels grew thenny pibber, my Hallan war Berthonsia, Delion Vanner han geese. Minstrels pipe for us that we may dance together, as is the custom and the guise. In the early 1900s, a young marine illustrator called Robert Morton Nance moved into a cottage in the village of Nancledra near St Ives. The stories of Bottrell captured his imagination, and he immersed himself in the dialect he found around him, the stories and the folk drama of the droll tellers and the geese dancing. Inspired by these traditions, Nance wrote a series of plays. Initially these were aimed at performance by school children, but they were soon adapted for adults. In recognition of their origins, he called them Guys Dance Drolls. The story goes in the winter of 1919, a performance of one such Guys Dance Droll, Duffy and the Devil, captured the public imagination in St Ives and led to the formation of the first Old Cornwall Society. The Cledry plays, as they became called, were not published as a collection until 1956, and even then not all the plays were included. A number of unpublished drafts with extensive notes remain in the Nance papers in the Courtney Library at the Royal Institute of Cornwall. Individual snippets of songs were occasionally published in the Old Cornwall Journal and elsewhere, notably Tom Walcock's Even More of a Fair, both of which were brought to a wide audience by Cornwall's First Lady of Song, Brenda Wootton. And the song Tom Walcock Thieves has since become an integral part of the Mousel celebration of Tom Walcock and his Stargazy Pie on the 23rd of December each year.
A merrier place you may believe was Mousel on Tom Walcock's Eve. To be there then who wouldn't wish to sup of 7 sorts of fish. When the murky breath cleared the path, come lances for to fry. And then a sad a bit of scat and starry gazy pie.
At the age of 79, Jim Thomas was the first person to be made a Bard of Gorseth Kernow in the inaugural ceremony of 1928. He took the bardic name Taz Cameron, Father of Camborne, which hints at the reverence within which he was held. True to his aspiration to wrest Cornwall's cultural heritage from the world of academia, Thomas's formal education was limited. He worked as a miner abroad in his younger years and returned to Camborne to spend 30 years as a postman before retirement. Our interest here is in his contribution to folk tradition, but for the Old Cornwall movement of the time, he was also renowned for his knowledge of antiquities. Jim Thomas had been a point of contact for folk song and dance collector Cecil Sharp when he visited Cornwall in 1913 and 1914. Although only acknowledged by Sharp as one of his singers, Thomas was a folklore researcher in his own right, as well as being a singer. Thomas introduced Sharp to traditional singers from Camborne, Redruth and Helston, and personally provided him with 15 of the 66 songs taken down in Cornwall. 3 of Jim Thomas's songs were arranged and published in the Old Cornwall Journal, and 8 were included in Ralph Dunstan's Dialect and Folk Song. He contributed a further 14 articles to the journal on games, rhymes and folklore, and was often cited by other contributors. Tom Miners was a younger contemporary of Jim Thomas, and also one of the sources for the songs collected by Cecil Sharp in Cornwall. He lived in Pen Ponds near Camborne, was a schoolmaster, established folk song collector, and one of the founders of the Old Cornwall movement. In 1915, he prepared a paper for the Royal Institute of Cornwall on folk carols from Camborne, and contributed an article on Cornish carols for the Folk Song Journal in 1929. In many ways, Miners' detailed recording balanced Nance's somewhat creative approach to folk tradition in the developing Old Cornwall movement. Tom Miners was a popular speaker at Old Cornwall Society meetings, wrote a number of articles covering topics from folklore to guise dancing, as well as folk songs and carols. William Watson worked closely with Nance in collecting dialect words for use in a revived form of the Cornish language. Watson left school at 13, worked as a gardener, and was entirely self-educated, which reputedly resulted in him being ignored by the academically and class-disposed Jenner. Watson's claim to still finding Cornish expressions and vocabulary in use within the Cornish community was inevitably going to ire Jenner, who felt that it was he who had interviewed the last people with traditional knowledge of Cornish some 50 years earlier. They shared platforms at Old Cornwall Society meetings, and Watson was praised for his work on folk tradition, so tensions were probably not terribly high. William Watson nevertheless embodies Nance's mantra that Cornish cultural heritage should be owned by the people of Cornwall rather than the academic community. Watson contributed regularly to the journal on topics linked to folk tradition and the Cornish language. Some of his songs in Cornish were captured on wax cylinder by the American folklorist James Madison Carpenter. Carpenter was a Harvard-trained folk song researcher. He visited Cornwall at least twice between 1929 and 1934, and when he contacted members of the Old Cornwall Society, they would seem to have descended upon him like bees around a cask, eager to pass on their stories and their songs and their sense of a Cornish identity. Using a wax cylinder, supported by notes on a portable typewriter, Carpenter recorded some 44 folk songs and plays from Cornwall, including 3 from Miners, 5 from Bessie Wallace, and 11 from Watson. There are several sources named Thomas amongst Carpenter's notes, but none are identifiable with Jim Thomas, but he was clearly there in spirit, if not person. The wax cylinder recordings of Watson, which include his version of the Sunday Carol, are some of the oldest audio recordings in Cornish. Interestingly, Nance also supplied Carpenter with information about the original Pastor Mummers from the recollection of his father, who grew up in the town in the 1840s. Singing was not the only tradition that Bessie Wallace inherited from her father. She was a popular dialect reader and storyteller within the early Old Cornwall movement, and her stories were published in the journal as well as the local press. These stories capture the dialect and folkways of Cornwall, as well as setting the songs and the guise dance customs in context. Importantly, Bessie Wallace set the example and encouraged future generations of Cornish dialect readers. Jim Thomas was born in the mid-19th century, and between them, he and his daughter provide a link between the droll tellers of Bottrell's Celtic world and the dialect readers and storytellers of modern Cornwall. Although not so involved with living traditions, Barbara Spooner and William Painter, the wonderfully nicknamed Cornish Witchfinder, deserve quick mention here as pioneers of the Old Cornwall movement. They focused their attention on the stories and folkways still remembered in Cornwall during the interwar years, and they show the continuity with traditions recorded by folklorists like William Bottrell a century earlier. They were researchers rather than participants or revivalists, but nevertheless did capture an important part of Cornwall's distinct folklore heritage. They represent a move away from the pisky-led fake lore and Great Western Railway tourist promotion of the early 20th century towards recognition of a significant body of Cornish Celtic mythology. And of course, Painter's research into cures and charms also give us a kind of view of the pre-NHS world. Jim Thomas, Tom Miners and William Watson were regular speakers at early Old Cornwall Society meetings, along with Robert Morton Nance and Henry Jenner. The focus was often on folk customs, games and singing traditions such as carols. At the February meeting of the St Ives Old Cornwall Society in 1921, Nance talked about the Cornish custom of hurling, which had been popular throughout the 19th century but had become limited to St Ives and St Cullen. During the ensuing discussion, concern was expressed that the hurling at St Ives feast day was at risk of dying out, and it was resolved that the tradition should be supported by the Society, including the purchase of a new silver ball. This was the first intervention of an Old Cornwall Society to support a tradition, and it set the scene for many others to come. It is difficult to know the extent to which crying the neck was still being practiced in the 1920s. It was always by nature an intimate local event that attracted no more than occasional attention in the press. It was clearly well remembered by Old Cornwall Society members and was a popular topic in talks and discussions on Cornish folk traditions. On the 28th of August 1928, the St Ives Old Cornwall Society created their own ceremony on a farm at Tywednac. As well as inspiring other Old Cornwall societies to stage their own Crying the Neck, this event encouraged recorders across Cornwall to make note of their own local traditions. At Withiel, for example, a corn dolly was made from the neck and hung in the kitchen until Christmas, when it was fed to the best cow to bring fertility for the year to come. On the evening of Golowan, Midsummer's Day, in 1929, a chain of bonfires was lit from Chapel Cornbray at St Just to Kit Hill on the Cornish border. As well as reinvigorating an age-old tradition, this represented the coming of age of the Old Cornwall Society movement, which had now spread right across Cornwall. The ceremony was set out in Cornish and English, and MCs were encouraged to provide an introductory speech explaining both the history of the custom and the revival of Cornish Celtic identity that it represented. Cornish singing tradition was in no need of revival or revitalisation when the Old Cornwall Societies first formed, and were an assumed part of events like the Golowan bonfires, Crying the Neck, as well as Federation gatherings at the winter festivals. Robust renderings of Trelawney and well-established songs like the Sweet Nightingale were joined by Cornish adaptations of popular songs and a plethora of new compositions expressing Cornish identity. There was an interesting discussion in the winter festival held at Redruth in 1926 as to the nature of folk songs and whether popular new Cornish compositions would ever be considered traditional. Titles like the Cornish Wrestlers' song Candle and Lantern, obviously smugglers, Mevielsy Hall, Tryphena Trineri, Patties and Cream, they all provide us with a window into perceptions of Cornish identity at the time. Many of these songs have long since disappeared, but some have joined Tom Balcock's Eve and More of a Fair to feature in the album of singers like Brenda Wootton. The Old Cornwall Society recognised the need for a specifically Cornish songbook suitable for community singing, wherever Cornish men and Cornish women foregathered the world over. Dr. Ralph Dunstan was an author's choice to lead on this project and published 2 collections, the Cornish Songbook in 1929 and a sequel, Cornish Folk Song and Dialect in 1932. His collections were largely sourced from old Cornwall activists such as Arthur Matter from Weybridge. One of his songs was the Eccleshall Ringers, sung here by Charlie Bate at a Padstow or Cornwall Society meeting in the 1970s.
Now Craddock the cordwainer, he did ring the treble bell. John Ellery was the second man, no man could him excel. The third was Pollard Cobbinger, and the fourth was Thomas Cleave. And Goodfellow was the tenor man, that rung and rang so brave. Landlord and Sir David, Sir Judy and Bill, but we five boys and men the same, and all the
Dunstan's collections contain 73 traditional songs and tunes which continue to underpin Cornish tradition to this day. He also included tea treat tunes that he recorded himself as a boy bandsman in the late 1880s. Here we have Sunny Corner from Ralph Dunstan, recently videoed by an Austell Town band for the Tea Treat project. Now, geese dancing is an enigmatic Cornish tradition. The term itself is probably a dialect conflation of the Cornish giz, meaning guys, and gaze, meaning a mockery or a jest. The geese dancers adopted a variety of costume so that they would not be recognised, and processed from house to house or pub to pub to enact a piece of folk business, which might be a song, a wassail, a folk play, a dance, or a combination of all these things. The narrative of the song or drama was adapted to topical or local circumstances, often at the expense of the audience, thus the value of disguise. Courtesy of people like Jim Thomas and Tom Miners, many examples of geese dance traditions were captured in the pages of the Old Cornwall Journal. The geese dances of St Ives have a long history. In the 1850s, the custom was to travel from house to house entertaining, as described above, But by 1900, popularity had overtaken the custom, so it became a large, rowdy procession through the town. It had gained some notoriety, and one commentator noted that what seems to create the greatest fun and is the most enjoyed by the crowd are the men dressed as women, women dressed as men, girls as boys, boys as girls, some of whom, under influence of drink, perform sundry antics which, for vulgarity, would be hard to beat. Wonderful. The St. geese dances seem to have burned themselves out by 1926, and the Old Cornwall Society became concerned about its future. They put their shoulder behind the event and succeeded in a healthy, if slightly more temperate, revival. It's gone several changes since then, but the guises themselves can be seen over Christmas period and during St. feast, thanks to Old Cornwall Society members Dave and Dee Brotherton to this day. At the Winter Festival in Penzance in 1929, A.K. Hamilton Jenkin praised the Knives of Cornwall Society for the revival of the town's geese dance and urged Helston to consider doing the same for the Hallan Tow. It had taken place as part of Helston's Folklore Day, but died out in the late 19th century. Helston, or Cornwall Society, used information provided by older Helstonians and an observational trip to the Pastor May Day celebrations in 1929 to reconstruct the Hallan Tow, and it was performed by boys from the Helston Grammar School at Folklore Day in 1930. The tradition was inherited by Helston Community School in the 1960s and opened out to involve the wider community in 2000. On the 4th of January 1937, the BBC's Western Regional Service had Hamilton Jenkin introducing a broadcast of the Madrid geese dances. He warns the listeners to look out for strangely garbed people roaming the streets on these dark nights, taking part in an ancient Cornish tradition. Inspired by the success of St. Ives and the Hallan Tow, the Madrid or Cornwall Society revived the town's own geese dance, with players using costumes that had traditionally remained within the families. The geese dancers included a Miss Phyllis Trevorrow, who did the ancient broom dance, wore a costume which is nearly 150 years old. She learned the dance from her great-grandfather. Sadly, Miss Trevorrow was not filmed, but here we have a more recent video of the Cornish broom dance. Just like the singing, Cornish dance tradition was in no need of revival in the formative years of the Old Cornwall Societies. Just as geese dancing had provided a medium for step dance, so the parish feast, tea treats and coastal regattas do so for other folk dance traditions. Cornish tea treats remained popular events during the interwar years, with dances like the serpent, the snail creep, the miller's dance, as well as the broom dances we've just seen. Robert Morton Nance paid tribute to the step dance tradition in his guise dance drolls, with dances like the cobbler's hornpipe. but provides only outline instructions for the dances and leaves it to the players to improvise. Elizabeth Shapcott was one of the founding members of Loo Old Cornwall Society in 1927. In 1929, she gave a talk on feast day customs in the area and describes a number of dances. She talks of dancing to a fiddler in a barn or a field or even the highway, if it was fine, and describes a clog dance providing a percussive accompaniment to singing. The dances mentioned by name are the 4-hand, 6-hand and 8-hand reel, the triumph and the cushion dance. Over the next few decades, other recorders and contributors provided information about dances, dance games and the music that went with them. Sometimes descriptions and sometimes just snippets for the Crowdy Crawn page, all of which provided an invaluable legacy for succeeding generations of Cornish dances. Well, it can be seen that the old Cornwall societies did considerably more than gather a few fragments. In the first 25 years of the journal, there were 64 references from oral sources and a further 52 from other texts. Added to the work of Dunstan, then we have upwards 200 folk, customs, dances and songs captured by the Old Cornwall movement. The numbers are interesting, but the real legacy of the societies is the way in which folk songs, dances and the associated customs have remained a living tradition in Cornwall. The advent of the Celtic Festival in the 1970s created a demand for Cornish musicians, drama and dance groups who could deliver traditional and original material relating to Cornwall in their performances. It was the work of the Old Cornwall societies that was quarried for both traditional material and creative inspiration. In 2014, the UK government announced that the proud history, unique culture and distinctive language of Cornwall would be fully recognised under European rules for the protection of national minorities. In many respects, this was the realisation of the aspiration to build a new and self-confident Cornwall, embraced by the Old Cornwall movement back in the 1920s.